Thanks, Dave. Yeah, so I know the focus is on student presentations today, but I decided to make sure I could wave the microbiomes flag a little bit. And also, our current honors student, Jessica Grierson, is not able to present today because she is frantically finishing writing her thesis, which is due in about 3 weeks. And Penny Jones, our other Healthy Landscapes co-lead, is not able to join us today. So I'm kind of helping to present some of the work that the three of us have been doing. In other words, I'll be talking about healthy parentheses, microbial urban landscapes. Oh, and I'm Dr. Emily Fleece. Okay. So I got interested in this area because my background, so I've always been in love with nature and spending time outside, and I've also always been interested in human health. And so in 2007, when humans officially became an urban species and the majority of humans on the planet started living in cities, it got me thinking about how that's influencing human health and what this novel urban environment is doing to us as humans. So over the 6 million years of humans' evolutionary history, we have generally lived in close relationship with nature. We've been surrounded by plants and soil and animals, and now we're living in these cities where we are surrounded by cement and steel and plastic and people. And over this same period of time, well, not quite 6 million years, but anyway, the last couple hundred that we have data for, there's been a massive change in the disease burden as well. So this is an example from the 1900s to 2010 from the New England Journal of Medicine, showing how that disease burden has changed. And I want to show you two things with this figure. One is that decline in the probability of dying in a given year. So we're living longer, healthier lives, and that's a really good thing and has to do with our advances in antibiotics and vaccinations and nutrition and sanitation. The other important thing is the changing trend in what's killing us. So it used to be gastrointestinal infections, tuberculosis, pneumonia, and those infectious diseases. And now those are largely eliminated as one of the major killers. And what we're seeing now is heart disease and cancer and non-infectious airway diseases being more important. And these are population adjusted numbers. And so there's a lot of reasons for that. One, of course, we're living longer. Two, we have better diagnostics. But I wonder, what does it have to do with that relationship in urban living and how we have changed our lifestyle? So a couple of years ago, I gathered together some colleagues who have expertise in different areas of public health, such as nutrition and respiratory disease and infectious disease and gastrointestinal infections. And each person sort of looked at the literature within their field of expertise about the association between diseases and urban living in cities. And so we wanted to identify what are urban associated diseases. And the outcome of that was that we identified some potential urban associated diseases, and there's a lot of caveats around this. We're looking at big picture trends of what diseases tend to be associated with cities. And we found associations for asthma, allergies, cardiovascular disease, some types of cancer, some types of infections, some types of mental health conditions, multiple sclerosis, inflammatory bowel diseases, among others. And so we started categorizing them and then looking at the reasons that they might be associated with cities. What about the physical environment of cities was contributing to these disease associations? And some of those are represented here. So first of all, air pollution is often higher in cities and is the most important environmental health risk factor around the world. So that was reinforcing, actually, that we found that was really important. We know in Australia that's related to about 3,000 deaths a year, and around the world something like 3.4 million. So that's an important feature of cities that can contribute to disease. But a really interesting one that emerged from this dive into the literature was this altered microbial exposure that we get from living in cities that can also contribute to disease trends. So related to that is the fact that cities don't have a whole lot of nature in them. So cities obviously vary in how much green space they have, but compared to areas outside of cities, there's less dirt, there's less vegetation in them. And that's important because generally we know that interaction and engagement with nature is good for our health. So this is another study I did with some colleagues in New Zealand, looking at a systematic review, looking at the health benefits of interacting with green space. And we tried to explore that relationship with biodiversity and what role biodiversity played in moderating those health effects. And what we found, along with a mountain of evidence, is that interacting with green space is generally good for our health across a range of measures of health and well-being. And we did find that there was support for this idea that biodiversity is important, but it's mostly theoretical at this stage. So there's some important hypotheses around why exposure to biodiverse microbial communities in particular can help modify the way our immune system functions in ways that benefit our health, but that they were generally there wasn't a lot of great evidence connecting it to green spaces and urban green spaces in particular. This is obviously out of timer, so I don't know what's going on. Okay, so this is one way that you can visualize those connections. So that big green box is exposure to biodiverse urban green spaces. And if you follow those red arrows, this paper explored those connections between how biodiverse green spaces create a diverse environmental microbiome, or the bacteria, protozoans, fungi, et cetera, the small little germs and bugs that live in the soil or in the air or on the surface of plants. That's the environmental microbiome. And the environmental microbiome may be impacting the human microbiome through that red arrow. The human microbiome modifies the immune function and the way our immune system works. And those two things, the microbiome and our immune function, are related to just myriad health effects. So they influence everything from our mental health to our physical health through how we respond to infections. So just a quick dive into that microbiome area a little bit more. This has really been a revolution over the last decade or so in human medicine, is this recognition that the microbes, again, bacteria, fungi, et cetera, that live on and in our body are influencing every aspect of our health, from the specific diseases like inflammatory bowel disease to obesity. They modify the way we can gain calories and metabolize the food that we eat. So they're associated with obesity. This understanding of how the microbiome modifies the way we metabolize pharmaceuticals was the breakthrough of the year in 2017 for cancer immunotherapy. So the bacteria that you have in your stomach determine how you respond to immunotherapy treatment and whether or not it'll help you get over, regress your cancer, your tumors. And the gut-brain axis is something that's been, relatively well characterized now, and how the gut microbiome modifies mental health disorders, including anxiety, depression, and even autism. So that human microbiome, the microbes in our body, which we now know are about as numerous as our human cells, are these microbial cells, is really important for our health. And what's just been emerging in the last couple of years is some studies around how the environmental microbiome impacts that human microbiome. So we breathe hundreds of millions of microbes every day. So you can imagine that that has an influence on what microbes are living in us and living on our skin, et cetera. But it's just beginning to be characterized. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the work we're doing here very briefly. This is a picture of Penny Jones, and we've been working in close collaboration on some of these projects. Penny's background is mostly in air health, human health, and the things that we're breathing, and smoke and pollution, and now microbiomes. And so we started out last year, actually after a conference we co-hosted with Dave, looking at microbiomes around Tasmania. And with some colleagues from that conference, we did an analysis comparing the microbes found in humans, those are the yellow ones, whether those at the class level, whether those bacteria were present in ocean microbial communities and soil microbial communities. And for all the most abundant human bacteria, they were present in both oceans and soils. So we use that to say it's important to look for these connections. Our microbiome is related to these other microbiomes. And then last year, Penny and I did a systematic review where we looked at all the studies that tested the microbes in the air, the aerial microbiome, and compared urban and rural aerial microbiomes. And so the hypotheses in this field are that exposure to a greater diversity of microbes, especially during early human development, is good for our health. So we wanted to know, are urban areas more or less diverse than rural areas? And are there more abundant microbes in one or the other? And what we found is from that literature that generally rural areas have more abundant airborne microbial communities. The density of the microbes is greater in rural areas and they're more diverse. And this is some of the work that Jess is just analyzing now for her thesis. But Penny and I have done a lot of sampling now around Hobart in 2018 and 2019. And we've just finally finished analyzing those samples in the lab. So we were building capacity at UTAS to be able to do that analysis in the lab here. And we've just finished getting that through a bioinformatics pipeline to actually get the data. And we've got it back just a couple of months ago. And Jess has been doing an amazing job analyzing this first bit, which is comparing public and private green spaces across a population density gradient. So population density being one measure of urbanness. And this is one of her findings, is that the diversity of the soil microbial community, in this case, is declining with greater population density. So in the most dense areas, there was lower diversity in the soil microbes than there were in more rural areas, which is really interesting. So that fits with the aerial analysis that we've done, the systematic review we did, but it actually doesn't fit with some of the literature around soils. So there's going to be some interesting things to explore in how city size impacts this, how dense that population is, and some of those more nuanced relationships there. And so we've done this sampling around at least 50 sites around Hobart, sampling soil and air, and we're just about to do that analysis in the next couple of months. Okay, so that's sort of some of the work that we've done. Big picture, I'm interested in all of these connections, how global urbanization is impacting biodiversity, and how those two things impact human exposure to biodiverse nature. There's still a bit of a black box of mechanisms of how that relates to human health and human well-being. And I want to know what's the role of microbiomes in that multidimensional human well-being as well. And hopefully, if we can understand that better, we can create healthier cities and healthier microbial urban landscapes. And I would take questions, but I think we're a bit behind in time, so hopefully you can ask me them afterwards.